The storm screamed across the wasteland like a dying beast in chains. Snow punched sideways through the air, thick enough to choke out sound and sight alike. The landscape was white and blind, burying everything that had once lived here. Deep. In that frozen silence, a faint shape stumbled over the icy ridge. Her feet barely moved, more dragged than lifted, and her skin, green and glowing faintly, was nearly blue from the cold. Her long red hair was matted with frost, her hands trembling as she shielded her face from the cutting wind. She had no weapons, no tools, just a thin, torn suit that no longer kept out the cold. Her voice had gone hoarse from screaming hours ago, and her lips cracked with every breath she forced through the pain. Her name was Kyra. She was not from this world. But her people had once claimed it. That was before the humans arrived. Before the satellites fell and the sky lit with flame. Before her entire colony was reduced to broken signals and silence. The war had come fast and left only dust. She hadn't fought in it. She hadn't even understood why it started. One moment she was in training drills. The next, she was running through burning snowfields, trying to find her unit, trying to stay alive. And now, here she was, alone, starving, lost in a storm that didn't care who won or who suffered. Her body screamed for shelter, and somewhere ahead, through the thick white air, she saw it, a glow, orange and warm and real. A bunker built into a mountain shelf. Human construction. The edges were too sharp, the door too small for her kind, but she didn't care. Her legs moved without her consent. Her instincts had taken control. She collapsed, twice before reaching it. The wind dragged her down and buried her knees. She crawled, using the last of her strength to slap her hand against the reinforced steel. Her voice cracked as she whispered the words she never thought she would say. "I'll be a good girl," she choked. "Please let me in." Inside the bunker, the scanner lit up with a soft chime. A tall man stood from a workbench, tools still in his hands. His beard was frosted, his uniform torn in places, but his posture remained strong. His name was Mason, ex-Marine, the last one stationed here after the retreat. Order was given. He watched the monitor showing the alien girl outside, a green-skinned enemy, shaking and barefoot in the snow. Every protocol screamed not to open the door, but something in her eyes wasn't hostile. It was something else, something human. He stepped to the door slowly. His finger hovered over the lockpad. It would be stupid. It would be against every order in the book, and yet he pressed it. The metal door hissed and cracked open. A rush of frozen air punched into the warmth. Kyra collapsed at his feet, breath shallow and fingers curled like claws. Mason dropped to one knee and caught her head before it hit the floor. She was light, too light. Like her body had burned through everything just to reach this place. He checked her pulse, found it barely there. He should have called command. He should have restrained her or pushed her out, but instead, he picked her up, Kyra's. Eyes fluttered open for a moment. She saw his face weathered, scarred, and filled with something strange. Not pity, not fear. Just tired kindness. Her vision went black before she could speak again. Mason carried her to the med pod, setting her gently into the cradle. As the scanner wrapped around her, he leaned back and exhaled sharply. What the hell was he doing? Oh, she was an enemy. A soldier from the other side. But his gut said otherwise. Maybe she was just a girl running from death outside. The blizzard howled louder than before. And inside, two survivors who should have been enemies had just rewritten the first rule of this war. Asterisk, the heat from the bunker stung her frozen skin. It wasn't painful. It was a shock. The kind of heat that made nerves come back to life and remind you just how close to death you had been. Kyra's eyes fluttered but did not fully open. Her breath came shallow and slow. The medical pod hissed. softly around her body, scanning damage that went far beyond the surface. Mason watched the readings flash across the monitor. Hypothermia, blood loss, muscle fatigue, no weapons detected, no embedded trackers. She was barely alive, and yet her vitals were holding. The medpod was doing its job. But she needed rest, time, calories, and trust. He paced the floor, his boots making sharp sounds. On the steel panels, this was insane. He should have contacted command hours ago. They'd scream in his ear and send a drone to extract her. Maybe worse. But something in her broken voice kept playing in his head. The way she said those words. "I'll be a good girl. Not as a trick, not as a soldier. As someone begging to live." Kyra didn't wake until hours later. The room was quiet, humming with the soft noise of machines and wind muffled by thick walls. She stirred and coughed, and the pod opened automatically. Warm air touched her skin like a blanket. She blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. She tried to sit up, but failed. Her muscles betrayed her. Every inch of her body felt like stone. But then a cup appeared in her view. Warm broth, held by a man with worn eyes and tired posture. He crouched beside her and didn't speak until she reached out. "You're not dead," he said plainly. She drank slowly. The warmth traveled down her throat and settled in her chest like fire. Her voice was too weak to speak clearly, but her eyes didn't leave his. She studied the man who had let her in. Human, male, not afraid, not angry. It's watching. Mason stood and pulled over a second chair. He didn't touch her again. He sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor for a while. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low and slow. "You were the first I've seen alive in 6 days," he said. "That's not luck. That's something else." She nodded slightly. Her throat still burned, but she forced a word out. "Kyra," he glanced at her. "Mason." There were no handshakes, no smiles, just a name for a name. In the silence that followed, the snow outside battered the walls like fists. Mason leaned back, resting his head against the steel and exhaling slowly. This wasn't part of the plan. None of this was. Kyra tried again to sit up and managed it with a painful grunt. Mason didn't help her this time. He watched her struggle and overcome it. When she finally sat upright, she pulled the blanket tighter and looked at the sealed door. "Why did you open it?" she asked. Mason didn't answer right away. He scratched his beard and stared at the wall as if it might explain things for him. When he finally met her eyes again, his face was unreadable. "You sounded like someone who didn't want to die," he said. Kyra laughed weakly, not out of joy. It was dry and bitter, but she didn't argue. She had begged, pleaded, broken every coder people taught about showing weakness, and he had answered. She would never understand why, but she was alive because of it. The room felt too quiet now, too small. She looked around, taking in the tools, the faded maps on the wall, the half-finished machinery. A place made for survival, not comfort. A place made by someone who expected the world to end. Mason stood and stretched. "You should rest. You'll need your strength. Storm won't let up for days." She nodded. But even as she laid back, down, her mind kept spinning. This man had no reason to help her, no orders to follow, no reward waiting. He had done it because she cried, and in this war, kindness was rarer than air. Kyra woke up again, this time without pain. Her body still felt weak, but her mind was clear. The warmth of the bunker wrapped around her like a second skin. Her fingers stretched and her legs twitched under the thermal blanket. She sat up and looked toward the small kitchen area. Mason stood there cooking something in a metal pot. Steam rose as he stirred, and the smell filled the air with sharp spices and heavy protein. He didn't look at her as he spoke. His voice was calm, practiced, like someone used to talking to walls. You've been asleep for almost 12 hours. Your blood pressure's holding. Muscle regeneration's already started. You'll walk by tonight if you eat enough. Kyra pulled herself up from the bed and sat on the edge. The motion was slow but steady. Her hands gripped the edge for support. She watched him closely. The man moved like a soldier, even in silence. Every motion was precise and careful. He had survived here a long time. He handed her a bowl of hot stew. She sniffed it and blinked in surprise. It wasn't disgusting. It smelled good. Earth spices maybe. Human food. Her stomach growled loud enough to make him glance at her for the first time that morning. It's safe, he said. No poison, no tricks. Just eat. You look like a skeleton with green skin. She gave a faint smile, but said nothing. The stew burned her tongue at first, but tasted better with each bite. Warmth spread from her chest to her limbs. It felt like life was returning with each swallow. For the first time since the war began, she wasn't afraid. Mason sat across from her at the workbench. He didn't talk much. He let her eat in peace. The silence was comfortable in a strange way. Not empty, just quiet. Like they both needed the break. After a while, she broke it. You live here alone? She asked. Yeah, was part of an engineering team. Everyone else left or died. I stayed. Why? He looked at her. This time, he didn't smile or look away. Because someone had to keep the heat running. Power stations don't repair themselves, especially in storms like this. She nodded slowly. She didn't fully understand humans yet, but she respected duty. Her people valued it too. It was a kind of honor. For glory, but for survival. In a war this cruel, even keeping warm was an act of rebellion. Her eyes scanned the bunker again. It was old but efficient. Tools were lined up neatly. Shelves held supplies, not trophies. A folded flag rested in a glass frame on the far wall. She stood and walked toward it slowly, bowl still in hand. That your planet's banner? She asked. Yeah, United Earth Fleet. That one came from my brother. He died up north. Frozen over while trying to fix a comms relay. Kira touched the glass gently. Her fingers left faint fog on the surface. She didn't say sorry. The words felt too shallow. Instead, she nodded once. A gesture of respect that needed no translation. Mason stood and walked to the sealed door. The small screen beside it flashed weather patterns. Red bars covered most of the map. Storm levels remained critical. He didn't have to say it. She already knew. You can't leave yet, he said. I wasn't planning to, she replied. He looked over his shoulder. You were enemy forces, but you're not anymore. As long as you don't try anything, you're safe here. Kyra sat back down and looked into her bowl. Only broth remained. She felt her body getting stronger with every minute, but her mind remained clouded with questions. Why did he trust her? Why did she feel safe here? Why didn't she want to leave yet? Mason pulled out a small datapad and sat across from her again. If you're staying a while, I might as well learn something from you. You people communicate using frequency tones, right? Her eyes widened in surprise. You studied us. I studied everyone. Didn't think it would matter. Guess. I was wrong. Kyra smiled for real this time. It was small, tired, and still hurt her cheeks, but it was honest. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, she felt like something inside her had cracked open. Not pain, not fear. Just a spark that said she might not be alone anymore. The next morning, the storm showed no sign of slowing. Wind screamed against the steel walls of the bunker, trying to claw its way inside. Snow covered the outer sensors, blinding. the weather map and muting the world outside. Inside, Mason and Kyra moved through a quiet rhythm. She had regained full mobility and no longer needed help walking. Her steps were slow but strong. She kept the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her eyes on the shadows of the storm. He showed her the water. Filters first, then the power. Converters and solar backups. She watched closely, asking short questions. He answered simply, never with more than he needed to say. Trust was still new between them, but it was growing. They spent the day fixing a damaged heater near the back wall. The pipe had cracked from ice pressure, and frost spread along the ceiling. Kira held the light while Mason worked, passing him tools with silent precision. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. At one point, Mason looked up from under the panel and saw her staring at him. Her expression was unreadable. Not hostile, not afraid, just focused, like she was still trying to figure him out. He didn't speak. He just went back to tightening bolts. Later, she boiled more broth. Her hands shook slightly, but she managed. She poured 2 cups and brought one to Mason, who was already seated with the datapad. They ate in silence. The only sound was wind pounding against metal. "I never thought I'd be here," she said quietly. Mason raised an eyebrow. "In a bunker with a human." Kyra gave a small nod. A live Mason sipped his drink and leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first enemy soldier I've met. But you're the first one who didn't try to kill me on sight." She chuckled softly. "Too cold to fight. Too tired to hate." He gave a short laugh. Not mocking, just honest. They both understood that war made people strange. Sometimes it broke them. Other times, it forced them into situations that felt more like dreams than orders. When they finished eating, Mason pulled out an old holograph projector. He placed it between them and activated it. A small rotating globe shimmered into the air. It was Earth. Blue and green, beautiful and distant. Kyra leaned forward. "That's your home." "Yeah. Not much left now. At least, not the way I remember it." She stared at it for a long time. The colors reminded her of her own world before the war, before the skies turned black, before everything burned. She didn't speak. She just watched the planet spin in the quiet hum of light. "Your people attacked first," Mason said finally. "That's what our side says." Kyra didn't flinch. "And mine say yours did." "Maybe it doesn't matter now." "No, maybe not." They sat like that for a while, a human and an alien staring at a glowing orb in the middle of a frozen hell. No weapons, no orders. Just two survivors trying to understand how they ended up in the same room. The storm outside roared louder. The structure creaked from pressure. Mason tapped the screen and the hologram vanished. He stood and stretched, then looked at Kyra. She hadn't moved. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll need it. Tomorrow we clean the vents. If they freeze, this whole place goes dark." She nodded and stood slowly. "Good night, Mason." He paused, then nodded once. "Good night, Kyra." She returned to the small cot in the corner. Her body ached, but her mind was calm. The warmth of the bunker, the scent of hot food, and the quiet presence of a human who should have been her enemy all settled. Over her like a shield, she curled under the blanket and stared at the ceiling. The wind was still there. So was the cold, but for now they couldn't reach her. She closed her eyes and finally slept without fear. The vents were half frozen when they found them. Ice crystals formed sharp edges around the filters. Mason crouched with his gloves on, using a heated tool to melt the buildup without damaging the frame. Kyra stood beside him, wiping down the outer surface. They had spent the whole morning working in silence. Only the hiss of melting ice and soft clangs of tools filled the air. Mason's breath fogged inside his helmet. Even inside the bunker walls, This section was dangerously cold. He didn't complain. Kyra finished wiping the upper pipe and climbed down the ladder slowly. Her hands were numb. Her arms ached, but the work kept her focused. She had no time to remember the screams from her fallen unit or the fire from the sky. Mason packed up the tools and nodded once. That should keep it clear for a few more days. We'll check again after the next drop in pressure. Kira followed him back to the warmer level. They stepped into the main chamber, where the heater hummed strong and the recycled air felt rich. Her skin prickled as the heat returned to her fingers and face. It almost hurt, but she welcomed it. Mason poured 2 mugs of nutrient tea and handed her one. They sat at the workbench again, steam rising between them. The silence between them now felt comfortable, shared, like they had carved out a space where words weren't needed to feel safe. "You're not what I expected," Kyra said. After a few sips, he looked at her over the rim of his mug. "And what did you expect? Cruelty, fear, revenge, maybe?" He shrugged. "I ran out of all that when the second wave hit. I stopped expecting anything from anyone, just focused on staying warm and breathing one more day." Kyra looked at the wall where his brother's flag still rested in the frame. "You lost people too. Everyone has. That's what war does. It burns through the ones we care about first." Her grip on the mug tightened. Her gaze dropped to the table. "I was supposed to die outside. That storm should have ended me. But you opened the door." He didn't respond right away. He stared at the swirling liquid in his cup. When he spoke, his voice was low and flat. "You cried like someone who had no strength left to hate. I couldn't ignore that." They sat quietly again. The storm outside had begun to die down, its voice now softer, less angry. Light filtered through the tiny observation slit near the ceiling. Snow still fell, but it was slower now. Gentle, like the world was trying to rest too. Mason stood and moved to the supply cabinet. He opened a small drawer and pulled out a black square device. He turned it in his hand and looked back at her. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Kyra leaned forward. "A beacon. Yeah. Emergency contact unit. If I activate it, the fleet will pick up my location. Yours too." She stood slowly. Her body tensed. "So why haven't you used it?" Mason placed the beacon on the table. "Because I don't know what side would show up first." Kyra blinked. His words hit her harder than expected. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the risk of ending this fragile peace. The moment a ship landed, it could all collapse again. "What if they come and take me?" she asked. "Then I'll tell them I never saw you, that I survived alone, that the storm took everything else." "Why?" He didn't smile. He just looked tired, because war should not get to decide who you become. "You're not my enemy anymore. You're just someone who asked for help." She stepped closer to the table and looked down at the beacon. It felt heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in consequence. One button could change everything. One choice could bring more fire, and for the first time since the invasion began. She didn't want that. The snow finally stopped 3 days. Later, the skies outside cleared just enough to let weak light shine over the frozen ground. Visibility returned, but the cold remained sharp. The world still felt like a graveyard, silent and still. Kyra stood near the sealed door. She watched. The outside feeds through a small monitor. Her breath fogged against the glass. She didn't ask to leave. She only stood there for a while, thinking about what waited beyond the bunker. Mason approached from behind, carrying a dado ship in his hand. He placed it on the shelf beside her. "That's all the recorded weather patterns from the last month. You might want it if you ever go north." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He didn't ask if she was leaving. He didn't ask what her next plan was. He knew this moment was delicate. After all they had shared, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. About deciding what kind of people they still were. She turned and leaned her back. Against the wall, her arms crossed over her chest. I wasn't trained for this. I was supposed to be an engineer. But when the war started, they gave me a gun and told me to march. Mason gave a dry chuckle. That's how most of us started. No medals, no strategy. Just cold hands and bad orders. Kyra looked at the ceiling. I hate it. Not just the war. The silence. The not knowing who made it out. The not knowing if my people will ever stop. Running, he nodded. That's why I stayed off the grid. The war stopped being about truth a long time ago. She stepped forward. Do you believe peace is even possible anymore? He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with tired eyes. Then he pointed at the small table where they had shared so many meals. Two people from opposite sides can eat together? Without reaching for weapons, then maybe there's still hope. She smiled, but it faded quickly. I don't want to go back to them. Not yet. Not until I'm sure I won't be used again. Then don't go. She blinked. What? Mason picked up a small notebook and flipped it open. Pages were filled with hand-drawn maps, power, schematics, water routes, and scavenging plans. He held it out to her. If you're staying, I could use help. The Western Solar Relay needs cleaning. The perimeter sensors are half frozen. You know machines better than most. Kyra stared at the notebook. Her hand hovered above it before she finally took it. The pages felt like warmth in her grip. Like purpose. Like belonging without force. I'm not staying forever, she said. I wouldn't ask you to. Just until the snow clears and you're sure of your next step. She nodded again, more firmly this time. Then I'll earn my place. No pity. No pity. Only work. She walked toward the tool rack and grabbed the thermal wrench. Her feet moved with more purpose now, her shoulders straighter, her eyes clear. The decision had been made not by pressure, but by choice. A rare thing in a world torn by war. Mason followed her, pulling on his gloves. Let's start with the external relay. If we let it freeze over again, we'll be melting ice by hand for weeks. Kyra held the wrench tight. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding something. It didn't matter if it was temporary. It was real. It was hers. The wind outside began to rise again, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a challenge. The snow had thinned to scattered flakes. Visibility stretched for miles under a pale sun. Kyra stood on the roof hatch, goggles strapped over her eyes, staring at the open world beyond the bunker. Her breath came in slow bursts, fogging the inside of her mask. Mason was beside her, checking the satellite dish. It had taken damage weeks ago and hadn't received a signal since. He adjusted the calibration using a makeshift toolkit he had built from scraps. Kyra held the scanner steady while he worked. They had worked together in silence for days now, fixing, cleaning, updating. The bunker no longer felt like a tomb. It was something else. Something alive. Something that responded to effort and care. And now it responded to them. There, Mason said. Connection green. Maybe we'll catch an old signal or two. Kyra tapped the receiver. It buzzed softly, then blinked once. A faint pulse echoed back. Not a message. Not yet, but a sign. Proof that anyone was still out there. Back inside, Mason logged the coordinates into his system. The console hissed as the signal was stored and processed. Kyra watched over his shoulder, her arms crossed, eyes unreadable. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. What if it's your people? She asked. He didn't turn around. Then I decide what to tell them, and if it's mine. I let you decide. She tilted her head. Just like that? Mason looked at her now. I don't control you. Never did. You walked in asking to live. Now you're living. What you do next is up to you. Her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was pride or fear, maybe both. She had never been trusted with freedom before. Her commanders barked orders. Her squad mates obeyed instinct. No one had asked what she wanted. She walked to the corner and opened the storage locker. Inside were the few personal things she had gathered. Tools, a folded blanket, a sealed bag of gear from before the war. She stared at them like they belonged to someone else. Mason sat back and watched her. He didn't speak. He gave her the space she needed. He had learned that she didn't like being rushed. When she finally turned around, her voice was quiet, but certain. If I go, I don't know what happens next. If I stay, I don't know if I'll ever leave. You don't have to know yet. She approached slowly and leaned on the opposite side of the workbench. Why didn't you call for rescue earlier? Get the beacon all this time? He looked down at his hands. 'Cause I was tired of being told what to do. Tired of being used like a weapon. Kyra nodded slowly. I understand that. They shared a long silence, not empty, just deep. Something passed between them without needing to be said. The kind of understanding that grows in shared space, in mutual survival. In silence where war once roared, the monitor flashed. A new ping echoed across the screen. Not strong, not close, but moving. A vessel, possibly civilian, possibly armed. Too far to tell, too near to ignore. Kira stepped closer. Someone's coming. Mason didn't move. He stared at the signal, then looked at her. Then we need to make a choice. Do we light the beacon or stay dark? She felt her throat tighten. Her heart pounded once. Her instincts shouted to hide. But a softer voice whispered something else. Something human. Something alive. Light it. Mason didn't hesitate. He flipped the switch. The emergency beacon hummed as it powered up. A low-frequency signal burst into the sky. A call, not for help, not for surrender. Just a message that said, "We're still here." Asterisk, the beacon's signal stretched across the frozen sky. It pulsed once every 5 seconds, steady and clean. Mason stood near the console, his arms crossed, eyes locked on the screen. He said nothing. As the data rolled in line by line, Kyra stood a few steps behind him, watching the same blinking dot. The vessel was closing in. It wasn't moving fast, but it was coming straight for them. There was no doubt now. They had been seen. They had been heard. ETA 6 hours, Mason said quietly. Kira nodded, but didn't reply. Her mind spun with possibilities. Rescue, arrest, reunion, separation. No outcome felt solid. No path felt safe. But the choice had already been made. They lit the beacon. There was no turning back. Mason stepped away from the console and walked to the small locker where he kept his sidearm. He opened it slowly, staring at the holstered weapon inside. After a moment, he shut it again without taking it out. No guns, he said. Kira gave a faint smile. Agreed. They spent the next few hours preparing the bunker. Mason sealed off sections that would be useless to outsiders. Kyra packed a small bag with supplies she might need. Neither said much. There was nothing left to explain. Only the arrival remained as the sky dimmed toward evening. The faint hum of an engine cut through the quiet. A low vibration moved through the ground. Snow kicked up outside the slit window as a ship descended beyond the ridge. They both moved to the airlock. The outer door remained sealed. Mason activated the external camera. The image was blurry through frost, but clear enough to show a shuttle. Sleek, small, unmarked. It had landed 20 meters from the bunker. No flag. No insignia. That's either good or very bad, Mason muttered. Kyra straightened her back and took a deep breath. "We go out together." Mason looked at her and nodded once. Together, he pressed the door controls. A mechanical hiss echoed as the lock disengaged. The door slid open and cold wind burst inside. Kyra squinted against the sharp air. They stepped out side by side, boots crunching into the ice. The shuttle door opened. 2 figures stepped down, human-shaped, covered in gear, faces hidden by helmets. One raised a hand in greeting. The other scanned the area slowly, but made no move toward a weapon. Mason raised his hand in return, but said nothing. The air between them held tension. Not fear, not yet. Just the weight of uncertain history. The 2 visitors stopped 10 feet away. "We received your beacon," the first one said. A woman's voice, clear, calm. "Identify yourselves, Mason." Spoke first. Sergeant Mason Reeves, United Earth Fleet, Engineering Corps. Assigned to Station 47. Status: Survivor Kyra stepped forward. Kyra of Arvet Dominion. Engineer turned conscript. Status: Survivor. The 2 figures looked at each other briefly. Then the first one spoke again. "You've been living together." Mason nodded. "Yes. Peacefully, we've kept the power grid stable. The signal array is functional again. And she saved my life more than once." Kyra glanced at him, surprised by the words. The second figure spoke now. A deeper voice. "Male? You're requesting rescue." Mason looked at Kyra. He didn't answer. He waited for her. She stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. "No, not rescue, not capture. We just want to be heard. We want this place to stay safe. No war." "Not here." The 2 strangers stood in silence for a moment. Then the woman lowered her helmet and revealed a tired, weathered face. Her eyes weren't hard. They were tired. Like someone who had seen too much destruction and wanted it to stop. "Then speak," she said. "Tell us what you've learned." Here, and so they did. They told the story of a war they didn't start and a storm that nearly ended them both. They spoke of shared meals, broken machines, and quiet trust built in a world meant for enemies. The cold didn't break them. The silence didn't divide them. Survival became something more, and in that barren place, buried in snow and pain, a human and an alien had found peace.